Vegetables were chopped, prepped, and sealed under saran wrap, cooling in the darkness of waist-high refrigerators tucked under prep tables. A vat of pumpkin curry soup, the soup of the day, simmered beside a brand new stainless steel open flame grill. The silverware was rolled, the bar was stocked, and the front of the house was organized and ready. In the kitchen, the restaurant staff stood at attention like soldiers, under sterile, humming fluorescent lights. They lined up by rank, from the general manager down to the busboy. The kitchen was silent, short of the cheesy, smooth jazz playing out of the sound system in the dining room, seeping under the kitchen's double doors. The man known to the staff only as Chef paced back and forth, inspecting his crew. The general manager stared dead forward, with her lips pursed in a harsh knot. She pulled her hair back so tightly that her painted-on eyebrows were perpetually raised, like she was in a constant state of horrified and furious shock. She'd unleashed her violent temper on the kitchen staff for weeks, and Chef knew she had little faith the restaurant would make it more than a month. Chef stopped at the maitre d' and inspected her uniform. Her black blouse was tucked in smartly, and her collar was starched. Of everyone in the line, she was the only one who looked happy to be there. Her shoulders were poised, but relaxed. Butterflies swirled in her stomach with a positive, excited energy. Her composure made Chef feel more composed, and he appreciated that. He nodded at her, and she smiled with her eyes. Her name was Joy. She was a kind person to her very core, from Cincinnati, and secretly wanted to be an artist. But she was never really happy with her talent or how Chef stopped himself. Whoa, okay, focus, stop it. Come on, man, woof, no background, no soul looking, none of that. Blah. Chef walked to the end of the line and stopped at the busboy. The busboy was in fact a 28-year-old man with a wife and 3 children at home. He rode his bike to the soft opening from his other job at Mount Sinai, Queens, where he did custodial work in the pediatric ward. Unlike the general manager, he had faith the restaurant would succeed. He had to have faith, as he had a family to support. Chef knew this. He felt both pity and compassion for the man. It was always the poor who had the most faith. No, stop this, Chef thought to himself. We're not doing this. That's the whole point. Get your shit together, don't break the rules. Focus. Jesus Christ. Chef's face contorted and he sucked in his lips. He hit the heel of his palm against his forehead to knock out the intrusive thoughts. The staff looked at one another out of the corners of their eyes as Chef had a silent, strange, self-flagellating meltdown in front of them. It went on for a few seconds until the general manager conspicuously cleared her throat and Chef snapped back out of it. Oh, just psyching myself up. You know, like you all gathered here today before me, I'm just a little nervous, I guess. Chef went into a speech to rally his troops. Tonight was the big night, the soft opening of Maison de Dieu. The high-profile guest list was invite-only, including food critic Pete Wells from the New York Times, Mayor Michael Bloomberg, Tony Award winner Tyne Daly, and international superhunk Leonardo DiCaprio. All their training and hard work had been leading up to this night. Chef had the utmost faith in them, and he had never worked with such blah 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 blah. The staff erupted in applause when he finished. Chef smiled and nodded and excused himself for some fresh air. He made his way out of the back of the restaurant, politely excusing himself as he bumped into Malik Wilson, the sous chef. Malik was born in the Bronx. He was raised by his older brother Matthew, who died of— No, dude, stop, enough, stop, you're breaking the rules, Chef screamed at himself in his head. He went out the back door and let the autumn air in Astoria, Queens cool his cheeks. Chef sat down on the asphalt and put his face in his hands. Ugh, I am in way over my fucking head, he whispered to himself. In truth, Chef was no chef at all. He wasn't a resident of New York City, although he knew it quite well. Furthermore, he wasn't even a resident of planet Earth, although he'd been twice before. The man the kitchen staff knew as Chef was in fact God. God the Almighty, the Alpha and the Omega, Allah, Adonai, Jehovah, whatever any person chose to call him, whether they believed in him or not. From outside, he heard the general manager shout that the house is open. and she loudly wondered where the fuck Chef was. Ugh. I think you fucked yourself here, pal, he said out loud. God's head spun, and he felt a panic attack coming on. He had to remind himself why he got into this in the first place. 6 Earth months prior, God had been taking a bath, feeling sorry for himself. He felt lousy because earlier that day, he'd broken one of his only rules and revisited one of his throwaway projects for the first time since abandoning it 44,000 Earth years ago. That project was humanity. Humanity came out of his short-lived carbon-based life form phase. But rather than wiping out people like dinosaurs or entire galaxies as he had in the past, he simply shelved the project when he got bored with it and moved on to other bigger things. But not before making what he now knew was a huge fucking mistake. This huge fucking mistake occurred in a cave located in what is now known as southern France. He was out foraging for fruit with a human woman when the skies opened up, and they headed into a cave for shelter. They quickly ran out of things to talk about, and God got bored. At this point, he was already pretty over his relationship with humanity. He made up his mind he'd leave Earth as soon as the rain stopped and she got home safely. God was scribbling in the dirt, munching on the berries they'd found, when he thought it might be kind of fun to teach her how to paint. He asked her if she wanted to see something neat, and she said she did. God mixed dirt and berries and water in front of her and scribbled an animal on the cave wall, just a simple stick figure of a dog. Her jaw dropped and her eyes went wide. God told her to give it a shot. At first, she put her hands up in protest, too dumbfounded by what she'd seen. God took her by the hand, dipped her finger in the paint, and guided her to draw a smiley face on the wall. She put her hand over her mouth and wept. God smirked, thinking it was kind of funny at the time, but his ears began ringing, and he had this sinking feeling that he'd done something wrong. The woman went back to the bowl and dipped her entire hand in it this time. She went to the wall and painted better than he could. She painted scenes of humans hunting, wild animals roaming the landscape, thunderstorms, lakes, rivers, trees. The woman was in a frenzy, enraptured by her newfound gift. God laughed and patted her on the shoulder. She painted all through the downpour, and he couldn't stop her, even when the rain stopped. "Just one more," she kept saying. He shrugged and decided he'd let her be. God exited the cave, looked both ways, and left planet Earth without realizing he'd made such a huge fucking mistake. That huge fucking mistake was called art, and it gave relatively intelligent apes the power to be beautiful, ugly, sublime, destructive, remarkable, terrible, or all of the above, all at once. He should have left humanity alone, like birds. Birds hardly gave anyone any trouble. God sat back, resting his head against the cool brick of the restaurant. He stared up at the sky and tried to remember why he arranged the stars in this galaxy the way he did. His other galaxies were much more ordered, each with a distinct cadence and personality. Every other galaxy had a specific clinical function. This one was more jazzy. 2 motorbikes roared down the street in front of him, popping wheelies and revving their engines. The teenager on the first bike just turned 16. His name was David, and unbeknownst to him, he had a tumor in his... No, dude, forget it. Forget it, God said to himself. Remember the rules. This galaxy was kind of all over the place. It wasn't perfect, but there was something raw and honest about the way he put it together. He'd really let his freak flag fly. God had thrown stars against the canvas and let them stick where they landed. He felt rather impressed by his work. Well, it's a neat experiment anyway, he thought to himself. A glass seafood tower crashed against the floor in the kitchen on the other side of the wall, snapping God out of his thoughts. The general manager started screaming like a lunatic at the kitchen staff. He could sense the fear, stress, and shame of the workers in the kitchen. God sighed, lifted himself up, and brushed dirt off his pants. He was about to go into the kitchen to settle things when the general manager popped off again at the staff, screaming insanely. "I don't have to deal with this shit," he said to himself. God wanted away from this place ASAP, and he remembered the East River wasn't too far of a walk away. He untied his apron, dropped it to the ground, and turned west down 23rd Avenue in Astoria, Queens. 6 months prior, the morning before God took that late-night self-pitying bath, tens of thousands of Earth years after he'd left planet Earth, and many more countless projects since, God was beset by an incredibly uneasy feeling. He'd woken up crying that morning, which was rare for him, as he was typically rather even-keeled. He had a dream that upset him terribly the night before, but he couldn't remember it. And that day, as he went about his work, pieces of the dream began coming back to him. At first, he felt darkness, then light. Then he could sense a familiar, fresh, cleansing smell. The intrusive thoughts distracted him from his work. He began doodling when it all came back to him. He dreamt about the cave on Earth. God tried to stop himself. No, he thought. Once you leave a project, it's done, man. Finito. No going back. We agreed. But God couldn't get planet Earth out of his head. All those crazy mini projects came back to him. Volcanoes, whales, hurricanes, viruses, and finally, humans. No. Remember the rules, he reminded himself. Leave it alone. But his mind wouldn't stop racing. Sharks, hippopotamuses, redwood trees, wolves. Fuck it, he said to himself. He set down his work for the day and cruised over to the Milky Way galaxy. He was nervous, but excited. It was the first time he'd returned to Earth since he left the world's first artist in that cave all those years ago, before he'd even dreamed of opening a restaurant. When he was about 260 light years away, noises began echoing in his head like a radio just short of landing on a station. God recognized the sounds as human voices, all attempting to reach him and far more advanced than he'd left them all those years ago. He couldn't figure out why they'd need him. No other project had ever reached back out. Other projects knew their place. They didn't see themselves set apart or different or creative or imaginative. The cave, you dipshit. Whoopsies. God walked down the slope of Astoria Park down to the East River. The park was empty except for people here and there going for a night run or walking their dogs. The sustained roar of the RFK Bridge echoed over the water. Every so often, an Amtrak train went over the Hell's Gate Bridge and disappeared into the Bronx. God thought about that name, Hell's Gate. To humans, hell suggests there's a heaven. Hell suggests there's a devil. Heaven suggests an involved, watchful, and vengeful God. God kinda wished there was a devil, at least to bounce ideas off of. He knew there were gods in other universes, but he'd never met any of them. He wondered how he measured up against the other gods. He wondered if they were more involved with their creations' day-to-day lives. Being so involved would be exhausting and beyond unrewarding, he decided. It wouldn't give his creation much credit, and it's not very fair to plant that idea. But still, as God sat on that park bench, he thought back about his second trip to Earth 6 months prior. He'd learned about Earth's past, and woo boy, humanity certainly had its ups and downs. He wondered if he'd created a monster, something more terrible than the dinosaurs. But as he looked out on the New York City skyline and saw a collaborative beauty that stirred even him, he let himself feel okay with his work. So God stood up and headed back to Maison de Dieu, trying to organize his thoughts about humanity and what he'd created now that he'd walked among them. Humanity wasn't perfect. Humanity wasn't terrible. If it was all bad, they wouldn't have made it this far. And also, humans invented love. God thought to himself, damn. So, back to his second visit. When God finally arrived to Earth, he was left speechless by what he saw. He was brought to tears by temples in Japan, constructed with more attention, care, and love than anything he'd ever done himself. He was again brought to tears by the destitution he saw, mile to mile, continent to continent. He watched families eat together. He watched people eat alone. He absorbed every book, every piece of art, every act of violence, every first kiss, every heartbreak, every held hand, all at once. The most terrible thing he encountered was loneliness. The most beautiful thing he encountered was jazz music. God felt himself grow a heart the way humans have hearts, in the figurative sense. He wanted to embrace all of them, the good and the bad. He wanted to shout, "Look at all you've done!" God even wondered if humanity had him beat. This made God feel very lonely. So lonely, he decided he needed to go home and regroup. Maybe he'd take a bath. He headed home and took that bath. He felt sorry for himself. He'd revisited a project, and that broke one of his rules, and now he was super paying for it. He couldn't shake the feeling that humanity had accomplished more than he ever could in a remarkably short span of time. As a god of science, God decided he'd put a hypothesis to the test. That hypothesis was, can I accomplish what a human could accomplish on planet Earth? He reflected on all he saw and tried to determine the best approach. He could make sustainable energy, but humans were already on that path. He'd just be stealing their thunder. He could make fancy shelters around the world to help the needy, but that seemed a little too cliché and narcissistic. God decided he had to try to accomplish a normal thing humans could do. Something not easy, but not impossible. And above all, no tricks. That's the rule. No reading minds, no looking into souls, no looking into the future, no looking back into the past. He had to act like a human and think like a human. No quick download of people's backstories or how all this shit on Earth is tied together. It was then, in the bathtub, God had a eureka moment. He decided he would go to one of the most competitive cities on planet Earth and try to open a restaurant. Objectively, it's a very hard thing to do. Most restaurants don't survive their first year, and you're nearly guaranteed to operate in the red for the first 5 years if you're lucky enough to survive in the first place. Fuck it, thought God. I'm gonna open a restaurant in New York City. God walked up to Maison de Dieu. The lights were off and the doors were locked. Uh-oh, he thought. He had either been away longer than he thought, or the night was a disaster, or probably both. Since the restaurant's lights were off and the front door was left unlocked, he decided he could break the rules and scan the past to see what happened. Oh yeah, he was right. He was both gone for way too long and the night had been a total disaster. To make it worse, Leonardo DiCaprio never even showed up. God walked around to the back parking lot and saw a shadow against the back door. He knew it was Joy. Since the restaurant experiment was a failure, he allowed himself to start using omniscient intuition again. Joy stood against the wall, kicking at the dirt. "Oh, hey there, Joy," God said, startling her.
"Chef, where did you go?"
"Ugh," God said. "I've been everywhere. So, how was it?" Joy laughed.
Not good.
Yeah, I guess it's good Leo didn't show up then.
How do you know he didn't?
God didn't answer. "Are you okay, Joy? I'm sorry about, you'll still get paid."
Why did you leave us, Chef?
God walked up next to her and leaned against the wall. "I don't know. I guess I'm not a very thoughtful being."
I think you're right, Chef.
God laughed. "Don't call me Chef. You can call me, Josh."
You really fucked us over, Josh.
Oh, yeah, I know. Yeah, big time. Ugh. God and Joy didn't speak as a train rumbled past. A silence hung even after it went by, until Joy cut back in.
Well, I'm off. I'd tell you I'm quitting, but I'm pretty sure that doesn't matter now.
Yeah, you're right. You have me beat. Joy turns left on 23rd Avenue and headed towards the train when God stopped her. "Hey, Joy! Wait a sec." Joy stopped as God ran to catch up with her. "I know for sure I can't run a restaurant, but I would love to teach you how to paint."